Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Adithya Gopinath. And in 3 weeks, he will be a research assistant professor at the University of Florida's College of Medicine. Today, we will be getting an update on Adithya's research efforts focused on the relationship between the central nervous system, immune system, and Parkinson's disease. So welcome back, Adithya.
Thank you, Deb. I appreciate it.
First of all, congratulations on the promotion, and so excited for you.
Thank you.
And then this is your second time on our podcast, and really looking forward to hearing all the wonderful things that have happened in the past year. But why don't we just start with, kind of backing up, and what is your main kind of research focus, and tell us about that.
So when we started our research program, 8 years ago now, it had just come to our attention that peripheral immune cells express a protein called dopamine transporter. Now, this protein, dopamine transporter, is traditionally studied in the brain because it's expressed by dopamine neurons that are impacted when a person gets Parkinson's disease. So when a person has Parkinson's, the levels of this dopamine transporter protein go down in the brain. And this is part of the reason why a person manifests with the symptoms of Parkinson's. So we started out asking a very simple, broad question. We said, well, this protein is also on our blood immune cells. So does the level of this protein change when a person has Parkinson's? And it could have gone either way, but it turned out very quickly, within 6 months, we were able to show that not only does it change, you actually have a dramatic increase in dopamine transporter expressing immune cells when a person is first diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And then when a person is successfully treated for Parkinson's, this actually seems to drop down towards, but not all the way back towards healthy levels. And so this is our first indication that there's a connection between the dopamine neurons in the brain and the peripheral immune system. And this really started us off on this quest to understand where this connection is, where the circuits are, where the neurons are, and how modulation of brain dopamine transmission can affect the peripheral immune system, in this case, specifically in Parkinson's disease.
So so that gets us to about last year, mm-hmm. when you were, in this kind of finding this exciting connection.
Right.
What has happened in the past year?
Very exciting things, really. So we were actually able to, in backing up a little bit, a number of people over the last 20 or so years had put out separate publications, separate studies. Some of them were linking the dopamine neurons in the midbrain, which are affected in Parkinson's, to a part of the brain here in the brainstem called the dorsal vagal complex. And it has the word vagus in it. And that suggests that this is actually the northernmost part of the vagus nerve. So it's right here, right above our neck. And other people in separate studies had connected the dorsal vagal complex to a bundle of nerves called the celiac ganglia. This sits right behind our kidney. And then yet other studies had connected the celiac ganglia to peripheral immune organs, including the spleen, the bone marrow, the thymus, the liver. And so we kind of started to put all these pieces together. The more I read, the more the puzzle pieces started to click. And we said, okay, so what if what we're seeing in Parkinson's disease is mediated by a link between midbrain dopamine neurons and the peripheral immune system via a midbrain dorsal vagal complex, or DVC, to spleen pathway? So this was the hypothesis that we started with. And I have to say, this is probably the first time that we started with a hypothesis that actually turned out to be right, because almost every time we make a prediction, it turns out to be either completely wrong or 180 degrees opposite of what we predicted. So it turns out that there are actually multisynaptic links, so multiple neurons that connect the dopamine neurons in the midbrain all the way down going to the spleen. And our spleen is a pretty overlooked organ. Most people don't think about the spleen, but it's actually an immune hub. And there are a lot of immune cells waiting in the spleen, waiting to mobilize as soon as something happens, such as Parkinson's disease. So if we modulate the function, if we increase or decrease the function of dopamine neurons in the brain, we're actually able to see an immune readout, a change in the immune function of the spleen. And this was very, very exciting to us because this was the first time any one group had been able to map a pathway going from dopamine neurons in the midbrain going all the way to peripheral immune organs.
So you've seen this in
Correct.
mice models,
Yes.
and so I guess I just have some other questions. Like,
Hmm.
if there's a relationship to the spleen,
Hmm.
what is it? And maybe this you wouldn't be able to answer this yet, but what is that if people have had their spleen taken out? Like, do you have a hypothesis on that in Parkinson's?
That's a great question. I don't know, to be honest. And I don't know that there's a lot of studies, a lot of, organized studies that have looked at people who have Parkinson's who also have had their spleen taken out, because it usually requires a pretty big injury for somebody to have their spleen taken out.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
don't
that's for
know for
sure.
certain. But looking at other studies, other medical interventions that impact this pathway, actually gives us some hints that this pathway is probably conserved in humans as well. One of the ones I want to draw your attention to is a lot of people will undergo something called gastric bypass surgery, and this is to help control weight. And typically, this has happened that people do this when they've attempted many other interventions, it hasn't worked, and they really need to improve their health. And so, this surgery actually reduces the size of the stomach, but as this is kind of a side effect, and I don't think the surgeons ever intended this, but they actually remove a portion of the vagus nerve below the diaphragm, right along with the stomach surgery. And it's been shown repeatedly that a lot of these people are less susceptible to addiction behaviors, are less susceptible to degeneration, neurodegeneration specifically. And nobody really knew what the connection was. Overall, people tended to think that this was just because people's health was better. But it suggests that actually interrupting that vagus pathway is changing the way a person's brain is functioning under a variety of circumstances.
Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Can you kind of back us up a little bit and give us maybe immune system 101 to kind of, because this area, you and I've talked before, this area of that connection between the immune system then in the brain is a fairly new area of focus.
Absolutely. So when people first started studying the immune system, this was back in the 70s and 80s, it became very clear that there are two major branches of the immune system. There's the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system, and these two work hand in hand. So typically, when a person gets sick, anytime you or I get a cold, we feel kind of icky on the first couple days. And then by day 4 or 5, you feel really, really bad. And then day 5, 6, 7, 8, you start to feel better. And by the end of about 10 days, you're pretty much recovered. And so this is actually very closely mapped onto the way the immune system functions. So the innate immune system is, evolutionarily speaking, a much older version of the immune system. So it's much less specific and it just kind of responds. Anytime anything is going on, the innate immune system turns on, wakes up, and starts to help your body to control an infection. And so those first few days, your innate immune system is kind of slowly ramping up into higher and higher gear. By the time it gets to day 4 or 5, it has ramped up to really its maximum, to the point where it can sort of kick off the adaptive immune response, which is the second phase. So the innate immune system is comprised of cells like macrophages, monocytes, dendritic cells, and these are located all through the body. And the adaptive immune system are B cells and our T cells, broadly speaking. And so the B cells and T cells, once those are kicked into high gear by the innate immune system, they produce a very specific immune response. So these B cells and T cells are able to very specifically go after infected cells or bacteria or pathogens and go and eliminate them, which is why day 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we start to feel way better, way more quickly, because those cells are very specific and they go right after the invaders.
So then the relationship to the dopamine is that in this, explanation of the immune system, does the disease of Parkinson lead the dopamine? in the blood and down through the nerves and in this connection, or where does, like, who's on first?
Oh, with regards to dopamine and the immune system.
Yes.
Probably dopamine. So dopamine is kind of leading the way here when it comes to Parkinson's disease, because what's happening in the brain seems to inform what's happening in the peripheral immune system. And so whenever you have a change in brain dopamine signaling, there's a subsequent change in the peripheral immune system. Now, it's unlikely that dopamine is actually traveling from the brain directly to, say, the spleen in this case. What's probably happening is, so this is a multi-synaptic pathway, meaning it goes one step and then there's another step and then there's another step and then finally makes its way to the spleen. And even though we haven't characterized the nature of each of those steps, it's very unlikely that it's dopamine being sent from step one to step two and then dopamine being sent from step two to step three and so forth. It's probably dopamine in the first step and then another neurotransmitter in the second step, maybe a third neurotransmitter in the third step, going all the way down to the spleen where we get changes in immune function. So the picture actually ends up being a lot more complicated than it looks. And so it's not just a wire. It's a series of very different circuits going from the brain all the way down to the spleen.
So then where does blood and our circulatory come into play here? Because I would imagine it has a big role too.
Oh, absolutely. So all of our cells in our blood are derived from our bone marrow. So we have the stem-like cells in the bone marrow that sort of proliferate and generate our red blood cells, all of our immune cells. And then they emerge from the bone marrow. They go to wherever they need to go to be educated. So there are different places in the body where immune cells basically go to school. This could be the thymus, it could be a lymph node, or the spleen. And then once the cells go there and they get educated, they learn what's an invader, what's their own cells. Then they're kind of in position. They're ready to start kicking off an immune response. Now, the moment anything happens, whether somebody starts to develop Parkinson's, they're treated for Parkinson's, or they get the flu, the immune cells are essentially waiting in all of these different places. It could be the lymph node, it could be the spleen, and they're sitting on the sofa. It's sort of like the ready room. And these immune cells are ready to go. They're ready to kick into high gear. So the moment anything happens, they get off the couch and they run. And all of this is mediated in our blood. So the immune cells exit whatever organ they're sitting in, they go into blood, and then they start doing their jobs.
So with this finding of this connection all the way from the brain down to the spleen and kind of the levels of dopamine through the disease, Parkinson's disease, what are the next steps? What is the next steps for you and the lab that you're in? What are you looking at next?
This is a really, really good question. What I'm really optimistic about. So essentially, we have Parkinson's disease that's inducing a change in the peripheral immune system, the peripheral immune function. Now, what we don't know yet, and there's a lot of evidence that supports this idea, we don't know for certain whether the immune system's function feeds back to the progression or development of Parkinson's disease. We don't know if it's a one-way street or it goes both ways, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it does go both ways. And this is particularly important because these cells that we're studying, that we're characterizing, that are changing in the context of Parkinson's disease or in the context of other diseases where dopamine transmission has gone awry. So the cells that are being affected here, we actually already have the tools to make these cells do basically anything we want. And this is thanks to the autoimmune disease field and the cancer field, because these two diseases, so autoimmune disease and cancer, both heavily involve the immune system. And in order to treat those diseases, we actually already have approved drugs that make basically every single cell type that we have, every immune cell type that we have, do different things. So if these cells actually end up being a target to help improve or slow the progression of Parkinson's, we probably already have the tools we need to do it. We just have to go looking for them and then apply them in a new case. So this actually opens up an avenue of treatment that we didn't imagine existed 10 years ago.
Wow. So what is kind of the current, for people that are suffering with Parkinson's, what is the current kind of treatment or, therapeutic? And then how might this really change that approach?
Oh, goodness. So many ways. So currently, all of our treatment strategies are aimed at improving Parkinson's symptoms. So when a person first gets diagnosed with Parkinson's, they'll usually be given L-Dopa or a drug called Sinemet. And this is a drug that provides the precursor to dopamine. And the surviving dopamine neurons in the brain will take up that drug and make extra dopamine to compensate for the neurons that have died. And so a person, when they take the drug for the next 2 or 3 hours, their movement symptoms are much better. And then the drug will slowly wear off, and then they have to take another dose. And they usually do this 3 to 6 times a day. Now, eventually, there aren't enough dopamine neurons left to respond properly to that drug. In fact, they have to keep increasing the dose of the drug to the point that they start having really, really bad side effects. So it's usually at this point that patients will go in for a surgery called deep brain stimulation. If they're a candidate for this, what this basically does is it puts these electrical leads down into a region of the brain that can modulate the activity of these dopamine neurons, the ones that are left. And in combination with that stimulation and a lower dose of the medication, the patients can often find some relief. The problem, though, and you can probably see this coming, is all of these treatments are aimed at improving the function of the patient, improving their symptoms, but it doesn't address the root of the disease. That is the fact that these dopamine neurons are progressively dying, and there's really nothing we can do to stop that. It just keeps getting worse until it's no longer tolerable for the patient. So what our study really opens up is the opportunity, if we're able to identify Parkinson's early, we may have the opportunity to either slow or stop its progression. That's really my dream. And that's the reason I come to work every day, is to hopefully find a way to buy 20 years, to buy 30 years, in which a person has, they're able to live their lives without the disease progressing. And the fact that we really haven't looked in the immunological realm in our immune systems for a treatment strategy really gives me a lot of hope because, like I said, we have the tools already. They exist. Now we just have to go looking for the right ones and apply them in the right way. And I hope that within my lifetime, we have a way to slow down or even stop the progression of Parkinson's disease.
Yeah. So that kind of explains the therapeutic side where it slows down or stops the disease. Is there also a spinoff on the diagnosis? Does this kind of finding help with diagnosing early the manifestation, if you would, of Parkinson's?
Yes, yes. Okay. So this is actually a key point that I left out earlier in our discussion. So the fact that we were able to detect the increase in dopamine transporter expressing immune cells at the time that a person is diagnosed with Parkinson's gives us some hope that it's possible that these immune cells may be changing even before the person comes to the doctor for symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So this is one of my dreams. This is something that I'm aiming to do right now. And one of the problems here is we have to be able to enroll people in our study who don't have Parkinson's yet or are willing to be monitored on a regular basis over an extended period of time to see if they develop Parkinson's disease. And that tends to be a difficult sell for a lot of people because they say, I don't have Parkinson's. Why should I get a blood draw every month or every 6 months just for you to see whether something happens? And so one of the ways that I'm thinking we can get around this is there are just a few genetic forms of Parkinson's disease. Most Parkinson's cases, 90 to 95% of cases, are what we call sporadic, which means there's no genetic cause. But in those cases that are genetic, these are people who know that their family members have had Parkinson's. They know that they might carry the gene for Parkinson's that might predispose them to Parkinson's. And there are whole families of these people. There are a few that actually attend our clinic here at the Fixel Institute. And my goal is to actually try and convince the people who have Parkinson's, who are carriers of the gene, plus as many of their family members are willing to participate as possible, who might be willing to be monitored over time, number one, because they already know they have the risk factor for it. And number two, if our blood test does actually reveal that they may be at risk of developing Parkinson's, that would be the window for us to intervene, to maybe even stop it from starting in the first place.
Are there other longitudinal studies on the progression of Parkinson's, or would this be kind of the creation of that first one?
Oh, no, there are many, many longitudinal studies. There's actually one very massive one called the Parkinson's Progression Monitoring Initiative, PPMI. And so this is an initiative that's enrolled thousands and thousands of people over an extended period of time to monitor whether or not these people develop Parkinson's, how badly their Parkinson's progresses, how quickly it does. And they draw blood samples, they draw all kinds of specimens from these individuals over time, and these are banked. Now, this would be, in theory, a very, very useful bank of samples for us to use. Now, one of the things we discovered right at the onset of this is that so all of these specimens are banked by freezing them. And one of the things we found out very quickly is the moment our blood samples are frozen, a lot of the data that we are looking for specifically for this test gets lost. And so that was very disappointing to us because when we first started this and we found this effect, we said, oh my goodness, there are tens of thousands of samples that we can apply to receive and study, but it turns out that we can't actually use them. So for this particular marker, this would probably be the first and only study so far that would investigate this marker longitudinally, that this marker being the dopamine transporter.
So is it dying because it's a part of the immune system, or why are those samples once they freeze? What's the problem there?
So it just turns out so different proteins respond differently to temperature changes. And our immune cells are covered in proteins. That's kind of how we identify them. That's also how they function. But this particular protein seems particularly susceptible to the freeze thaw process. And as soon as it goes through the freeze thaw process, we either can't detect it or we can predominantly detect it at levels that are not physiological, that are not normal. And we've actually tested this in the same subject over time. We take half of their blood sample, test it right away. The other half, we freeze it, thaw it, and test it again. And you can see the difference in one person between a fresh sample and a frozen sample. So unfortunately, it just turns out that this particular protein just doesn't like to be frozen.
That's too bad. So you need to have people volunteer. You need money to start collecting, the whole stand up there. That's what you need right now.
Yes, and actually, that's been one of the biggest hurdles because most NIH grants, so most of our research is currently NIH funded across the University of Florida, and most NIH grants are 5 years. And this is a study that would, by its very nature, require 20 years or 30 years of funding. And there are no financial mechanisms at the moment that allow us to plan a study out for 30 years. There are actually very few studies that have been conducted more than a scale of 5 years, even when it comes to things like clinical trials. So this is a huge stumbling block for us, but we're determined to get past it.
Yeah. So how do others do that? How do the other, samples, banks, how do they get around that? Do they have foundations that fund them in a long term, or how does that work?
Yes, actually. So, for instance, the Parkinson's Progression Initiative was funded by the Parkinson's Foundation. So, this is a private foundation that has an eye towards, longer term studies of this disease, which inherently is a long term disease. And there are a handful of NIH funded initiatives that are sort of structured for a very long term kinds of studies, but those are studies happening within the NIH itself in Bethesda in Baltimore. So these aren't really available to those of us who are not functioning inside the walls of the NIH.
Yeah, that's a challenge. So I know that your disease that you're focused on is Parkinson's, but there are relationships that, like to Lewy body dementia or some of the kind of the very rare neurological diseases that affect movement. I don't want to put you on the spot, but might this kind of open up some understanding to those diseases also as they get better understood?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the big problems with diseases that are related to Parkinson's disease but are not Parkinson's disease is that early on they all look the same. So when a person is first diagnosed with Lewy body disease, it looks like they have Parkinson's disease. And I know this from personal experience because I have a relative who has dementia with Lewy bodies or Lewy body disease. And for the first couple of years, we all thought he had Parkinson's. And we said, oh, this is going to be fine. You just have to go see a neurologist. You're going to get treated for Parkinson's. It's going to be okay. And now it's very clear that it's not Parkinson's, but this is 10 years later. And so, this is for the case for Lewy body disease, for progressive supranuclear palsy, and a variety of other movement disorders that manifest the same way. And so a lot of times people end up sort of barking up the wrong tree with regards to their treatment or management of their condition. So one of the things that this study, this particular test that we've employed, that we've developed, really allows us to do is if we're able to enroll enough patients from different disease groups, that is Parkinson's disease, supranuclear palsy, dementia with Lewy bodies, and so forth, we may be able to find these very subtle variations in the markers that we're looking at that will allow us to say, oh, well, at the time of diagnosis, no, you don't have Parkinson's, you have dementia with Lewy bodies. So it would really allow us to distinguish that. And this is going to make a huge difference in the quality of care that these patients receive.
Yeah, that's for sure. The journey that some people have to go on because of this is just it's heartbreaking. It's really hard. So, Aditya, now that you've been promoted or you're getting ready to be promoted, that brings on a lot of responsibilities for you and, as a researcher, as creating your own lab or that process. Have you given that any thought? And what are you thinking about?
Oh goodness! Wow, this is one of my favorite sort of daydreaming topics right now. So I'll sit there on a Sunday and I'll have my newspaper and a coffee and I'll be dreaming about the things that I'd be working on. So the thing is, we've been studying so far. We've been exclusively studying Parkinson's disease, but these same dopamine neurons that are impacted in a person who has Parkinson's are also involved in a huge number of other diseases. So for example, neuropsychiatric disease, so people who experience schizophrenia, they have dysregulated dopamine signaling, or people who have Tourette's or OCD. And then on the other side, you also have people. So all of us have been hearing about basically an epidemic of addictive substances that are hitting our streets. And all the common feature of all of these substances is that they change the way the dopamine neurons are functioning in the brain. And so if we have this very profound change when a person has Parkinson's disease. But all of our evidence so far suggests that we have equally profound but very different changes in the peripheral immune system in essentially any disease in which dopamine transmission has gotten messed up. So if a person is taking methamphetamine, for instance, obviously an illegal substance, but when a person, is abusing methamphetamine, we've actually been able to show, this is a sort of a spin-off research project that I had a couple of years ago. The peripheral immune system is dysregulated in a very different way than when a person has Parkinson's disease. And a person with methamphetamine use disorder is known to have immunological dysfunction, and they're known to have impaired wound healing. They're more likely to get infections, and that's separate from the fact that they're actually using a drug. It's actually changing their immune system. And this is also going to be the case for this is probably also going to be the case for people who are taking prescribed medications that change dopamine signaling. So one of the main ways that we treat ADHD right now is by giving medications that change dopamine signaling in our brains. But it's completely unexplored and really unknown how this might be changing our peripheral immune systems and what longer term impacts this might have on our health. So this is opening up a huge range of research ideas that we could pursue. In addition to investigating Parkinson's, in parallel, we could be investigating how a number of other situations in which dopamine signaling has been disrupted, how these impact peripheral immune function.
Wow, wouldn't that be something if the unintended consequences of some of these drugs to have really long-term effects, in aging?
It's a scary thought. And the thing is, we're all living longer now. So this is something we have to be increasingly cognizant of. And the sooner we find out about it, the sooner we can try and develop a way to get around it. And that's really how medicine works, right?
Yeah. Have you come across any of around spinal cord injury and its relationship to, just the immune system and kind of this disruption that you're talking about?
Great question. Actually, I have not. And that's an excellent area that we could investigate in the future because we have an excellent spinal cord injury team here at UF.
Yeah, I was speaking with a foundation a couple weeks ago that is really focused on spinal cord injury. There is a relationship with neurological diseases or degeneration, and they're starting to ask these questions of, maybe there's something there, and I was just kind of curious if you'd run across any of that.
I haven't. In fact, I hadn't even thought about it. So thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. Now I can add that to my list of things that I'm going to be digging into coming up here.
Your very long list of
Yes.
of things. It's good that you're a young man. We're very lucky for that. The passion and the excitement that you bring to what you're doing, I think is just it's super refreshing, especially right now when people are feeling kind of, concerned about research and all of that. But you just bring such hope and excitement. It's almost like you're insulated from what's going on.
This, having a positive outlook on things really helps us to get past the darker times. So if for everything that isn't working or isn't going well, there's always something that is going well. And it's important to be looking on the brighter side than the darker side.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've published these findings. What are the common questions that people are asking, or some of the kind of the probes that you've heard from folks that are working in the same area that may be using, your information here?
Oh, great question. So one of the most common questions I get, so if brain dopamine transmission can modulate the way the peripheral immune system functions, there are a couple of diseases, and I mentioned these briefly earlier, in which the peripheral immune system is the key player. And so these disease categories are autoimmune disease and cancer. And so I've had a number of people, actually audience members at conferences where I've given talks, stand up and say, "Excuse me, so if you can turn on or turn off dopamine neurons, or you can increase or decrease their function, and you change peripheral immunity, can we leverage this to be an additional treatment for cancer?" And in fact, my current mentor actually has a couple of pilot projects going on where we're investigating whether deletion of the dopamine transporter gene or drugs that change dopamine transporter function can actually change the outcomes in cancer. And so this is a very exciting area because nobody ever dreamed that dopamine neuron function could be related to cancer, but this actually seems to be the case. In fact, there was a paper that came out this time last year that showed that so there are multiple populations of cells in a solid cancer tumor. And there are some cells that are called stem-like cells. And these are the ones that are really, really hard to get rid of. And this is kind of why cancer likes to come back. And it turns out that these cells predominantly express dopamine transporter. And if you block the dopamine transporter in those cells, you actually improve the cancer susceptibility to normal treatment. And so you increase the likelihood of getting rid of it altogether.
Wow.
And so if that's the case for one kind of cancer, it's possible that this is going to be the case for other kinds as well. And so this is a question that I keep getting, the additional applications of this field of study to other diseases.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not all cancers are the same. So you would have to have that kind of specialty look for cancers. What about glioblastoma? I mean, have you given that because it's the brain?
Yes, actually, I'm so glad you brought that up because we just initiated a collaboration to investigate this. So hopefully in about a year, I should have some updates for you on that.
Oh, that'd be exciting. That's wonderful because if there's an area in kind of cancer research, that's one that really needs some hope.
And, it's funny that you mentioned glioblastoma because my initial interest in the intersection between dopamine and the immune system arose as a result of my training, some early training that I had in a lab that studied glioblastoma. And so this is I've been dreaming of applying our findings to our previous work in glioblastoma. And you asked the perfect question to introduce that.
That's great. Well, Adithya, this has been wonderful, and I'm so glad you spent the time. I'm going to give you the last word here on anything that I should have asked that I didn't that you want to get out there.
No, I think we covered all the scientifically relevant topics. The thing that I just encourage everybody is, especially right now, we have a climate of people being very nervous about their scientific futures. I keep reading articles in the New York Times and other newspapers that there's going to be a brain drain in America and all the scientists are going to leave. Please don't leave because we have so much to do. And there are going to be road bumps that come along the way. We have those every day in science. We have those every day in medicine. For every one theory that we find that works, there were 10 that didn't. And so we should just consider this another road bump and we just have to keep on.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what is encouraging to me is that there's a lot of philanthropy and a lot of people out there that are trying to look at partnerships or new ways to fund, which I think are very important and possibly very innovative for the future of research. So I do appreciate that. We will put your contact information in the in the show notes here so that people that would love to collaborate with you or fund you can find you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.